Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you. My name is Ina Kaluga. I'm the Senior Director for Violence Prevention and Response at the International Rescue Committee. And I'd like to welcome all of you to this final session of the forum, and thank you all for staying with us. Today, we explore something that sits at the core of humanitarian work, even if it's often treated as peripheral: justice as protection, and legal protection as a life-saving and life-sustaining component of humanitarian action. We've all been going through months of turmoil, and we're all still working around the humanitarian reset and defining its boundaries, its scope, and where it's going to lead us. It has pushed us to prioritize narrowly defining life-saving intervention. It's a push, it's a risk, it's not necessarily something we need to lean into. And focus matters. By narrowing definitions, we also need to think about the consequences of a narrow definitions, especially for people whose survival depends not only on food, water, or health, but also on being seen, on having access to documentation and assets that power their lives, having access to justice mechanisms, to the ability to claim rights, and to the ability to navigate their lives with dignity. As human beings and as practitioners, we all know that legal protection is never secondary. Many of the practitioners joining this call from different parts of the world are living in environments where they are navigating themselves the real life challenges of legal protection, and they are experiencing, I hope, more often than not, the real life benefits of legal protection in crisis settings. Justice is a lived outcome. It's one that shapes identity, safety, movement, belonging, and dignity far beyond any tribunal, any justice room, but into every daily interaction we have over how we live with our families, within our communities, with each other, and how we straddle the lines of conflict, the line of crisis, and the lines of hardship. It is woven into whether people can access services, whether they can rebuild their lives, return home, be recognized as rights holders, as parents, as spouses, as individuals. So across different crises, we've all seen the same patterns. Without documentation, people are excluded from assistance, health, education, compensation, safe migration opportunities. Without justice mechanisms, violence escalates, and women and girls and other marginalized groups can face more risks. Without housing, land, and property rights, families cannot return, or cannot rebuild, or cannot move forward and settle. And without legal identities, people can become invisible, and invisibility is dangerous. That is why today we are being joined by fellow human beings, by practitioners, and by leaders whose work sits at the intersection of justice, protection, and humanitarian action, and who navigate these tensions in real time. I would like to introduce our panel members. First, Nader Mouadi from the Legal Task Force for Gaza, Abdulrazak Sayabulawal from Rodat, Niger, Mrs. Paula Gavira Betancourt, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of IDPs, Ghulam Isakzai, the UN Resident Coordinator in Iraq, and Sarah Broad from the Swedish International Development Agency. As we discuss with this distinguished panelist, we are going to try and look at how justice and legal protection are core to survival and recovery. And we're going to begin where these dynamics are the most visible: the field, the places where our clients are confronting risk, the places where they are showing agency, and the places where legal protection needs to be felt at the most maximum level. So I would like first, Nader. Hi, how are you?
Hi, Ina. How are you?
Good to have you online.
It's good to be here.
Nader, as the coordinator of the Legal Task Force for Gaza, your work focuses on preserving documentation and legal pathways in an environment almost entirely structured around urgent material needs. And one of the big elephants in the rooms is that the situation in Gaza has often forced people to think about legal rights as secondary to survival. So what has it meant for you to maintain legal protection under these constraints? And what can you share with us about what happens when legal protection is deprioritized?
Yeah, Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to partake in this very important discussion. It's something that really hits the heart because in the field we see the efficacy of legal aid and the life-saving component of it. Um, I believe honestly the humanitarian reset and its hyper prioritization of the immediate aid fundamentally asks what we consider essential. And in a crisis like Palestine, legal work isn't optional. It truly is a life-saving crisis prevention that stops, future humanitarian disasters before they actually begin. And I feel that the narrow definition of life-saving could exclude, protection, which would leave behind people in two very catastrophic ways. One, like you said, by denying them access to current aid, and second, by really engineering their displacement. I mean, for example, in Gaza, legal aid is a detriment to survival and simultaneously future recovery as well. Now that we have a ceasefire in place, um, with mass displacement, it's led to widespread loss of all forms of civil and HLP documentation. And, if you can't access aid without an ID, but to replace an ID or to get a birth certificate for a newly born child, there were tens of thousands during the war. The Ministry of Interior and the families, they face this complex gauntlet of trying to get all sorts of prerequisite documents, which include things like marriage certificates, death certificates, divorce certificates, guardianship for unaccompanied children, personal data certificates, and they have to deal with a variety of authorities, whether it's the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Health, hospitals. And the cumulative effect of the nominal fees of these documents, when people are essentially displaced, they lost their livelihoods, it becomes an absolute financial barrier. And during the chaos of an ongoing genocide, and the breakdown of governance, the availability of domestic legal remedies and the procedures at play to recuperate those documents changes by the day. It's impossible for the masses to really track, how to go about recuperating a lost document. So we're constantly, tracking these developments, updating the information that we convey, whether it's in group information sessions, individualized counseling, or remote methodologies, which we became very dependent on in recent months because safety was an issue, and it wasn't safe to go to the field, nor was it safe to defer beneficiaries to institutions that were being targeted by aerial bombardment. But in securing civil documents for individuals without any form of identity, we essentially allowed them, one, to access humanitarian aid, like we said, and that's the basics like food, water, tents, cash. We allowed them to engage the banking system. So there were many people who had money in their banks, but they couldn't access that money. So they were essentially left without anything, no safety net. We allowed them to access the telecom system, to get a SIM card. Families were dispersed and divided geographically. That was the only way they could be in touch with one another. As well as an array of civil and private sector services, and also including the prevention of family separation and protecting children's rights to be with their mothers. Likewise, HLP documentation, it's also vital to access future shelter. I mean, we're racing right now to help people recuperate all sorts of lost HLP documents, whether it's lease agreements or land ownership or apartment contracts, proving that they purchased a flat. Because really an HLP investment, it's generally the largest investment or most valuable asset that a family has. And protecting those rights from day one is really critical for families' ability to survive and, from their economic rights that are linked to debris removal, but also their rights to adequate shelter, including tenure and security. We have, for example, a lot of vulnerable groups. We have now tens of thousands of orphans and widows who often face difficulties with their inheritance rights. And they require specialized legal assistance to secure their rights and to claim a home. While temporary housing, like a tent, isn't an issue if you don't have legal documentation. I mean, it can be when you have sparse, when it's not trickling in as it is now. But in the future, when reconstruction hopefully occurs, you will not be able to acquire adequate alternative housing to the housing that you lost unless you have your HLP documents. So securing HLP documents today really is the only path to a permanent roof tomorrow. And it's not only in Gaza, it's really in the West Bank too. I mean, the same life-saving logic applies to our work, where our main objective is to mitigate forcible transfer, the single biggest driver of humanitarian need in the occupied Palestinian territory. And mitigating forcible transfer is, in fact, mitigating acute humanitarian suffering. Demolition and eviction orders that are constantly issued to Palestinians directly violate Palestinians' rights to shelter, education, healthcare, and water, because demolition orders are across the board. I mean, they're being imposed on houses, on schools, on medical clinics, on water infrastructure, whether cisterns or water networks. And thus, challenging those orders, it's not only an emergency response, it's life-saving, as it ensures that the fundamental underpinnings of that sustain life can remain in place and people can have access to it. So when we challenge land confiscation orders as well, I mean, we're protecting livelihoods and food security for rural families that depend upon agriculture, animal husbandry for their livelihoods or survival. And when we challenge seizure of movable goods, which is another thing where the army is constantly coming in and taking things like solar panels and community assets and shelters and water tanks and animal pens, these are provided to these communities as humanitarian material aid. So essentially, we're basically preserving the shrinking humanitarian space or pushing back, so that way that we can protect the humanitarian. So by engaging in legal aid, we challenge the orders that seize or destroy humanitarian aid and ensure that the communities actually receive and benefit from the assistance that's intended for them. I can draw similar parallels. I mean, if we want to talk about, lifting restrictions on access and movement or holding settlers accountable for acts of violence and property damage, but I won't go into that for the sake of time. But I mean, in conclusion, if the narrowed definition results in reduced funding for legal assistance in humanitarian settings, in Gaza, it risks, one, restricting access to life-saving humanitarian assistance, and two, foreclosing the path for recovery for the most vulnerable groups. While in the West Bank, it would result in an exponential growth in need for humanitarian relief. It would create a deterioration in the humanitarian situation, and create a surge in the need for water, food, shelter, education, and would result in people being displaced who are already at a heightened risk of displacement for a third and fourth time. And two, it would, hence fail to address really the drivers of humanitarian need. It would be addressing the symptoms rather than the causes. And like I said, it would create a deterioration of the overall situation in the territory. Over.
Thank you very much, Nader. What you just shared was striking in many ways. One is that the narrative that legal protection is crucial to access assistance is one that by now we all agree on, that we know is true and people understand, even if they don't act on it. But what you also shared is a forward-looking lens, as in this is also about setting the stages and the basis to rebuild better, to mitigate deterioration of a situation that is already very difficult, but also the risk mitigation angle that you mentioned. The second thing that was really striking to me is something we rarely hear. When we lose the justice lens on humanitarian action, we tell a totally incomplete story, because the growing dominant narrative in Gaza today is one of chaos, is one of obliteration. You're telling a story of substantive needs of people still accessing phones, SIM cards, bank services. And what we see in the media and what our narrative reports and assistance zoom in on are basic survival's very important needs, but do not reflect the full depth of humanity that people have, that we're still navigating needs that are universally shared, to communicate, to access resources. And these are some of the things we risk losing if we don't tell the justice story. Is it something that you felt particularly challenging around the narrative emerging about Gaza?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I think legal aid is inseparable from the climate in which we operate, because the drivers of humanitarian need are basically legal here. It's a man-made crisis. It's not a natural disaster. You have one party that's constantly creating policies, procedures, regulations that constitute the military occupation. The military occupation is a system of legal bylaws, which are basically creating a coercive environment that's conducive of forcible transfer and is creating really the humanitarian crisis. So to devoid the humanitarian response of legal aid in the context of Palestine it just wouldn't make sense. It would be completely invalid. I mean, because it would basically create like a severe deterioration in the situation at hand. So that's essentially how I see it.
Thank you for that. I think that's a lens that we rarely hear, and the work you're doing in Gaza in very challenging circumstances is both challenging, but also provides a lens into what is possible. Because one of the things we're hearing about legal protection in humanitarian crisis is that it's not possible. And I think you're bringing also this this perspective of it is possible, we're doing it, even in humanitarian action. So thank you for that. And your reflections highlight how legal pathway can become fragile precisely when people need them the most, and that's why we need to invest in them. Let's shift for a moment to another context that is far away from Gaza, but that shares similar characteristics in many ways, in the ways people are facing pressures. Abdulrazak, bonjour.
Oui, bonjour.
Bonjour. Je vais parler en anglais, mais il y a la traduction. Abdulrazak is the head of Niger's leading human rights and governance network. And I would like to ask you, Abdulrazak, we've just heard about Gaza, which is a humanitarian context high on everyone's mind. And Niger is facing not only a protracted crisis, but also sits at the intersection of climate change, of conflict in neighboring countries, but also instability. I'd like to hear from you, how has the life-saving only framing affected the ability of people to resolve disputes, to access justice and secure documentation in Niger? And what are you seeing as risks when these systems are not sustained?
Merci. Je vous remercie de l'opportunité que vous m'offrez de porter la voix des femmes, des enfants et des hommes qui vivent chaque jour les conséquences des crises que traverse notre pays, le Niger. En réalité, nous sommes en face d'une crise multidimensionnelle. Et nous avons cette crise, elle affecte et modifie profondément les fondements même de la société, les dynamiques sociales. Et aujourd'hui, en 2025, nous avons plus de 2,6 millions personnes qui sont dans la situation de besoin en assistance humanitaire urgente au Niger. Parmi ces personnes, nous avons près de 800 000 qui sont des personnes déplacées internes. Et à cela s'ajoutent des réfugiés, des personnes réfugiées en provenance du Mali, des personnes réfugiées en provenance du Burkina Faso et des personnes réfugiées en provenance du Nigeria. Aussi, de l'autre côté, nous avons des migrants qui sont refoulés de la Libye et des migrants qui sont refoulés de l'Algérie. Donc, nous sommes en réalité en face de mouvements mixtes de populations qui vivent ensemble, deux fois en harmonie et deux fois sous des fortes tensions. Elles vivent dans des villages et dans des camps, et très souvent avec des ressources qui sont déjà très limitées. Donc, je vais, au fur et à mesure de mon intervention, illustrer par des cas concrets pour vous permettre de percevoir ce que nous menons comme activité et de percevoir aussi les conséquences qu'engendre la cessation de certains de nos programmes à cause de la coupure des financements humanitaires ou de la réduction de certains programmes. Je vais donner par exemple un cas de pression sur les communautés hautes. Dans la région de Tilaberi, nous avons un village qui s'appelle Ayoru. C'est un village qui compte environ 4000 habitants. Et pendant ces 3 dernières années, ce village a accueilli près de 5000 personnes déplacées. Près de 5000 personnes déplacées. Donc, au début, la cohabitation était pacifique, mais progressivement, au cours des années, elle est devenue conflictuelle. Elle est devenue conflictuelle. Vous avez des tensions autour des points d'eau, vous avez des conflits de pâturage, vous avez des litiges fonciers qui sont récurrents aux terres qui sont mises à disposition, et vous avez des risques accrus de violences basées sur les gens. Donc, c'est pour vous dire que nous avions un réseau de 25 cliniques juridiques qui travaillaient sur le plan de la protection et de l'aide juridique. Et donc, avant, nous faisons des mécanismes de médiation pour régler ce genre de litiges. Mais avec la suspension de certains programmes, ces mécanismes n'existent plus maintenant, ce qui a augmenté le risque d'une montée vertigineuse des, des tensions au niveau de ces communautés, surtout qui sont mixtes. Donc, moi, je pense que c'est pour vous dire que pour éviter ce genre de dégradation, il faut rétablir la justice de proximité. Il faut rétablir la justice de proximité. Parce qu'avec les difficultés que nous avons depuis 2023 et la coupure de certains financements ne permettent plus donc, à ces populations-là, surtout des populations mixtes qui sont, qui bénéficient de cette aide juridique. Aujourd'hui, donc, voyez-vous, l'accès à la justice est devenu très problématique. Je vais donner un deuxième cas, toujours pour illustrer. C'est le cas de Adifa. Adifa, nous menons des activités aussi. C'est le cas d'une fille, une enfant de 12 ans qui a été refusée donc, à l'école parce qu'elle n'a pas d'acte de naissance. Et sa mère se trouve que c'est une analphabète. Elle ne connaissait pas, elle ignore les procédures administratives donc, nécessaires. Et là aussi, une de nos cliniques juridiques a pris le cas en charge et nous l'avons accompagné gratuitement. Et dans un mois, nous avons obtenu l'acte de naissance à la jeune, à l'enfant, et elle est partie à l'école. Alors qu'elle ne partait pas à l'école il y a 2 ans de cela. Donc, voyez-vous, aujourd'hui, c'est des milliers d'enfants qui sont dans cette situation, donc qui ne parviennent pas à aller à l'école, faute des documents, faute des pièces d'état civil, ce qui compromet complètement leur avenir. Donc, en fait, c'est pour vous dire que l'aide juridique, ce n'est pas, comme l'a dit le collègue, ce n'est pas du luxe, ce n'est pas optionnel, c'est vital. Oui, c'est vital parce que la justice, elle protège les femmes contre les violences. Et la justice protège les enfants qui sont séparés de leur famille et qui sont exposés au risque d'exploitation. Et la justice, elle protège les familles déplacées dont les terres et les biens sont menacés. La justice, elle protège les communautés hautes qui cherchent à préserver leurs droits tout en acceptant d'accueillir les nouveaux arrivants. Donc, c'est vraiment, la justice, c'est un outil de prévention. Ce n'est pas un luxe, c'est un outil de prévention et de stabilisation communautaire. Je vais donner un autre cas, et un dernier cas pour illustrer, c'est le cas à Maradi, dans la région de Maradi. C'est un conflit entre hôtes et déplacés, un conflit de litige foncier entre hôtes. Il y a 2 familles, une famille déplacée et une famille haute. à propos d'un champ qui a été prêté temporairement. Et le conflit a éclaté et l'affaire, sans l'assistance juridique, l'affaire allait dégénérer à des violences. Mais nous avons intervenu donc à travers la médiation légale et nous avons réglé très rapidement et nous avons résolu le problème. Et ces genres nous faisons ces genres de choses-là et le taux de résolution très souvent dépasse même les 80%. Donc, c'est pour vous dire que la justice, c'est un moyen, c'est un outil de stabilisation, de paix et de stabilisation des communautés. Et, et sans la justice, je pense qu'il y a plusieurs vies qui sont menacées dans leur existence, dans leur vie de tout le temps, surtout le manque de documents et les conflits que cela engendre, parce que des populations qui vivent, qui sont différentes et qui vivent ensemble. Et le vivre ensemble, la clé du vivre ensemble, c'est la justice. Sans cette justice, il y a beaucoup de problèmes dont j'ai parlé, des problèmes, les enfants qui n'accèdent pas aux services sociaux, et les femmes, la justice, les violences qui sont aggravées, les litiges fonciers aussi augmentent. Et sans cette aide juridique, il y a beaucoup de difficultés qui apparaissent dans le bien vivre des communautés. Et je m'en vais, pour ne pas trop accaparer la parole, faire quelques propositions. Nous avons pisté quelques solutions.
On aura l'occasion de faire des propositions tout à l'heure à la fin.
Donc, voilà la situation du pays et voilà ce que nous faisons comme activité et voilà les conséquences qui sont qu'engendrent les difficultés qu'engendre un certain nombre de...
Merci infiniment. Thank you very much, Abdulrazak. I think it was really useful to see how in Nigeria you're balancing both the use of formal and customary systems to maintain dignity and mediate disputes that are arising from humanitarian situations. And that is something that is still a space that humanitarian actors are entering in, doing a better job at both leveraging formal and community-based and informal justice mechanisms. So thank you for that. To close this early chapter on civil society, I have a final question for now for Nader. Going back to the situation that you are facing, a question on my mind is, when legal frameworks are failing to prevent harm at the magnitude at which we're seeing it happening, do they still serve as tools of protection? And if so, what must change in how they are used or enforced? Or do you still think they're still tools for protection when they've been unable to prevent harm at such a high level, in your context as well as in others?
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer. I mean, to put it shortly, the answer is yes, for sure. As we discussed, legal aid remains fundamentally useful. But its utility is constantly being undermined by an extremely complex, multifaceted, ever-changing legal environment. I believe the ultimate testament to the efficacy of legal aid as being an effective tool for protection is the fact that the authorities that we litigate against are being forced to constantly change the rules of the game. Through the introduction of new policies and practices. And basically, they aim to make our strategies and tactics ineffective. Put simply, when we start winning cases, they change the laws to prevent further victories. Yet to continue providing protection through legal aid, we really have to rethink how we fund and sustain, one, legal adaptation and accountability. For example, in the West Bank, there's a patchwork of competing legal jurisdictions because the territory has been divided into areas A, B, and C. And each one has different, Israel has different controls and the Palestinian Authority has different controls over these different areas. There's Hebron H1, H2, which have their own special protocols. There's a large area called the Seam Zone, which has its own military procedures that prohibit access. There's nature reserves, people who find themselves living in military firing zones. And each of these geographic designations has its own legal structure in place that impacts access, movement, planning, building. And moreover, we have a broader divide where Israeli military law applies to Palestinians and Israeli civil law applies to settlers. So it's a very complex legal environment. And to further exacerbate that and complicate matters further, Israel's judiciary, which is our only means of domestic legal recourse, is highly politicized and biased in favor of the state and the settlers, who are often the perpetuators of human rights violations and subsequent humanitarian suffering. And the court essentially aims to put a rubber stamp on that, which is clearly illegal under international law. Yet, despite all of this complexity, yes, legal aid is effective. And we've developed methodologies and expertise over the years that still secure victories, challenging demolition orders, eviction orders, land confiscation orders, even though they might not be durable solutions on the books and technically would be considered maybe just temporary reprieve, what we call buying time. We still consider this a success. Because by overly complicating the state's ability to execute orders that would result in humanitarian suffering, we can stretch those interim protective measures for many, many years. For example, there's a case, an area called Masafer Yatta in the southern West Bank, which is an enclave of about a dozen Palestinian communities. And they were basically slated for mass demolition and displacement in the 1980s. Yet due solely to legal aid, now 40 years later, those communities still exist. They have been able to receive the material humanitarian assistance that they require. And actually, they've been able to adapt and accommodate natural growth within the communities. And we have many, many cases that we've essentially frozen for a decade or more. I mean, nonetheless, like I said, I mean, it's a constant cat and mouse game going back and forth. Our work is always met with constant procedural and legislative changes that really aim to undermine the efficacy of legal aid. And this forces us to go into a nonstop, resource-intensive cycle of innovation to adapt our programming to the ever-changing legal landscape that we operate in. And this ensures that legal aid remains a relevant protection tool to prevent forcible transfer and subsequent humanitarian suffering. But I mean, it's very, very resource intensive. The system in Gaza, I would say, is much simpler because there it's purely Palestinian civil law. And legal aid is effective, like we said, at securing life-saving civil and HLP documentation. But the main obstacle there is, like I said, institutional breakdown. We don't have any functioning courts. The very institutions that provide legal recourse have been destroyed. There's no archives of HLP documents. We're trying to piece that together. And in the absence of functioning civil courts, we've gone towards alternative dispute resolution. But the challenge I think that we face overall in our programming is manipulation of judicial procedures. I mean, beyond the introduction of new laws that aim to override judicial precedents, the positive precedents that we've secured, the court and the state, they work together in unison to undermine domestic legal recourse. I try not to say access to justice, but access to domestic legal recourse, because we don't really have access to justice here. Like, for example, the courts regularly grant endless 1-month extensions for the state to respond to our petitions. And this protracts litigation. Sometimes it's good. We want to protract litigation, but in other times we have an urgent petition, something that we need an urgent resolve, and that protracts and undermines the urgency of litigation. We also have the fact.
Yeah, sorry. I need to move us along, but I wanted to highlight that both you and Abdulrazak have highlighted the level of innovation also that you brought to your work in adapting to the circumstances that are emerging in your context. And that is something that I hope our next panelists can also touch on how the civil society interacts with the systems and how civil society is supporting the strengthening of the systems by bringing more creativity around how we yield rule of law instruments and legal instruments, and we push it towards reform. I have to push us along for a minute, but we will come back to you with those. Thank you both to you and Abdulrazak for now, and we'll be back. These realities across Niger and Gaza bring us to the next layer of this discussion, which are the structural and political forces, which Nader, you you just highlighted that determine whether legal protection survives when there are transitions and where priorities are shifting. I'd like to invite our next panelist, Ghulam, to join us on screen if possible, because I cannot see everyone. Good afternoon, Ghulam. How are you?
Good afternoon, Anna.
It's lovely to have you here. Thank you for your time. Ghulam, during your time as the resident coordinator and humanitarian coordinator in Iraq, you oversaw the transition from the cluster system to nationally led solutions. And issues like documentation, compensation, HLP rights were critical, particularly for marginalized groups. You've had to handle very complex cases around the Yazidi community, for example. Can you share with us how you kept justice visible in government dialogue in those transition times, and how you've addressed the structural and political barriers to sustaining legal protection services?
Thank you, and also great to be with all of you. I'll share some reflection from Iraq for sure that will frame our discussion and add to the reflection from the two other panelists' excellent interventions. So when I arrived in Iraq as RCHC 3 years ago, the country was already well into a major humanitarian drawdown. The cluster system had been, deactivated. OCHA and UNAMI, which is the political mission run by the Department of Political Affairs, were planning their exits. And we were moving into a phase where humanitarian function, especially protection, had to be absorbed into durable solution structure, both on the UN side, but also mostly on the government side. And one of the biggest question we faced was exactly, I think, what you raised today and what's coming up on how do we ensure that justice, civil documentation, compensation, and legal assistance do not disappear just because the humanitarian architecture is being dismantled. Because in Iraq, these are not just added extras, they are the core obstacles that prevent people from rebuilding their lives after a protracted displacement period. So let me give you a sense of reality and the context and how we are dealing with it. Iraq still has under 1 million IDPs, and roughly 200,000 of them are in vulnerable situation. But their challenges are not just really anymore about food or tent. They're about lack of legal identity, unresolved property claims, blocked compensation files, and justice systems that are either absent or sometimes not efficient or functioning, especially in places like Sinjar. And if you allow me, I'll use Sinjar for a moment because it really crystallizes the whole issue. As some of you know, a decade ago, ISIS militants overran the city of Sinjar that's located in northern Iraq. They killed around 5,000 Yazidi minorities. And also kidnap around 6,400, of which there are still 2,554 are missing. Now, this attack triggered one of the worst humanitarian crises in Iraq's recent history and displaced more than 100,000 Yazidis to flee abroad in search of safety, and not to mention also the displacement of other groups such as the Sunnis and the Shia groups and living in those areas. Now, after a decade of the ISIS atrocities, thousands of Yazidi families still cannot return because of various reasons, including security, lack of shelter, but also the courts are not functioning, documentation services barely exist, and also there's also an administrative vacuum. Again, I'll explain the political challenges around that. So without documents, of course, you cannot get compensation. Without compensation, you cannot rebuild your lives. And without functioning institution, you cannot return safely. So from the very beginning of this transition, we treated legal protection, documentation, for example, documentation, justice, and compensation, not as a nice to have thing, but rather as a life-saving an important factor in the durable solution for some of the displaced population in the Iraqi context. Now, how did we handle this during the transition from the cluster system to a durable solution mechanism? First we reframe the legal protection as an essential service, not as a specialized humanitarian activity or something that has to be looked at after. We pushed hard with some of the UN agencies, including IOM, UNHCR, UNDP, UN Habitat, and others, to integrate civil documentation and legal assistance into the broader social protection and governance system. And that is that we have to work with line ministries, governors, and local authorities, and to work with them and to insist that they take this into account in their budgeting system, but also in their planning. We also made sure that justice and accountability concerns were part of the durable solution planning. This was particularly important when, as some of you know, there was another UN entity called UNITAD when they closed, because they were particularly mandated to look at the issue of accountability and justice for the Yazidi and also atrocities committed by ISIS. So we advocated on when they left. We worked very closely with an institution that took over that function to make sure that there was evidence preservation and then survivor support and also a transitional justice mechanism that do not fall into a gap. The government of Iraq actually, through a lot of international our advocacy, passed the Yazidi survival law, which became a key or critical anchor for the administration of protection and justice for the Yazidis in particular. But again, its implementation is very uneven. Some survivors were receiving reparation and psychological support. Others have to wait years. So our job was to help governments strengthen these administrative capacity, simplify some of the procedure, and make the system more accessible and reachable for those people who were covered by this law. Also, through my office as RC and the UN system, following the activation of the cluster, we developed also the durable solution roadmap, which had the protection and justice as its core pillars. And moreover, we also, as UNAMI is drawing down and we are shifting from humanitarian to more development, we're trying to integrate social protection concern, especially the issue of justice administration, into the new UN cooperation framework, which is for the next 5 years. In addition, we also made sure that those that were still stuck in the system remain visible. Because one of the key risks of drawdown is always that the caseload simply disappear from political attention. So we work closely with the national authorities to harmonize displacement data and make sure that the most vulnerable household still remain on their radar, and ensure that when clusters are closed, those families don't fall through the crack. And then also at the political level, the UN was part of a big agreement. It's called the Sinjar Agreement, to actually help negotiate between the Kurdish authorities, regional authority, and the federal government. That was supposed to provide the foundation for return and governance of the Yazidi population in Sinjar. But again, it's been deadlocked because of many other disagreement between the regional government of Kurdistan and federal government. But this is where I also say that the nexus between humanitarian development and political tracks intersects. And that's where our role comes in also as a UN, where we had to maintain advocacy on justice and administration while we're trying to look for political solution, which some of these caseloads require, whether their lands are occupied or their security is not guaranteed by the state. So finally, also we mapped out where the UN could continue supporting justice and documentation beyond humanitarian phase. So in this process, again, UNDP focused on rule of law, UNHCR on statelessness and legal identity, IOM on compensation and returns, and UNICEF on civil registration, and UN Habitat on HLP. So these became the anchors of the post-cluster environment. And of course, my role was to make sure that there's proper coordination there. I have a couple of more minutes. Do you want me to stop here, or?
I just wanted to say that your example highlights also that the ecosystem that need to be interconnected for this kind of work. I mean, it's both an in-system influence work that you had to carry out in this transition, bringing the humanitarian system to shift and adapt to the transition in the context, as well as advocacy with duty bearers around you. And it underscores how political will is critical to shaping protection outcomes. And the reason why I wanted to bring in Paula at this particular stage, not to interrupt you, is because I see linkages between how her mandate engages exactly with these intersections, where protracted displacement need to be taken into account in development and transition plans. So if it's okay with you, I will shift to Paula for a minute. Paula, welcome to the panel.
Thank you, Iran. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you. Building on what Gulam was just shared, how has the reset influenced states' willingness to integrate legal protection for IDPs? What Gulam is sharing from his experience in Iraq showcases both the reality that displacement doesn't stop when context transition, displacement endures, entrenches vulnerabilities, and yet the context has shifted and the priorities are also shifting. So what are the systemic and political changes that, in your experience, are needed to ensure rights remain central during transitions, like the one Gulam was describing?
Yes, I was listening carefully because I've always wanted to know more about the Iraq experience. I heard a lot from the solutions advisor of all the work that was being done there. So it was great to listen to all the work. Well, we all know the process after the high level panel, the action agenda, the special advisor, and all this prioritization of some context and all this push for solutions. And I would say very importantly, not only this general approach towards seeing this also as a development issue, as we said in the high level panel, but also what you have said about the ownership and the leadership and the political will from governments, but also and mainly the solutions from the start idea, which I also links to everything that has been said today, and also to this, I would say, new push for localization, where what I've also thought is that all this talk and all this like strategizing and taking like decisions together towards localization really needs to be seen in the shifting of power, not only like in the shifting of the language. So too often what we see is that external actors that define the visions, as we have seen, for example, in the Gaza reconstruction process. But it's the communities. It's the communities that are expected, that are the ones that know what's better for them, and also we always try for them to be adapted to the plans that we decide and that we define that doesn't reflect their needs, their stories, their aspirations. So one issue is all this like push towards localization, towards solutions from the start that I see. I'm hopeful that more examples like the one that we were listening now from Iraq is important, or we know more and we learn more about those. I think the continuous interest from donors on the Internal Displacement Solutions Fund is important. I think it's important that we are now moving with the Solutions Hub, like opening a little bit the box to other contexts that are doing immense work on solutions and solutions from the start, but were not prioritized. So this like new phase, I think, for for the work on solutions is going to be really important, obviously with the stepping in of the financial institutions, and obviously an actor that we don't take into account as we should, and we said it in the high level panel, the private sector. So those are the issues that I wanted to raise related to your question. I don't know if we go back again or later to the barriers that hinder the integration of legal protection and rights-based approaches to humanitarian operations, but because I also have something to say on that question, Iran.
Yeah, so I'd like to go back to Gulam for a minute to see what
Okay.
he has seen as barriers, because there's been an enabling environment built from the global level, right? Where I think there's a consensus increasingly. Gulam, how has this been a factor of support for you, and what are some of the structural global barriers that you see in pushing forward this agenda in contexts like Iraq that are transitioning from humanitarian to development?
Yeah, I think I think in Iraq there are political, security, and also I would say administrative challenges to solutions. I think at the heart of it is really political. I mean, a lot of the humanitarian issues that have arisen in Iraq was because of previous decades of conflict and instability and sectarianism and so forth. So some of those people who are unable to receive proper justice and compensation is because there are political challenges that you have sectarian issues, and you have different ethnic groups, and you have groups that security groups that have also occupied some of the areas, and that prevents the return. But also actually the issue, the complexity of host communities and how they are perceived, and to what extent you balance support to make sure that both host communities and IDPs receive. I think on the security, I touched on it. Again, Iraq has, is trying to stabilize itself. We just had an election a couple of days ago, but some of the security issues within the country in terms of the various militia groups and how they actually influence also some of these decisions is there. Administrative, I think it's an issue of bureaucracy and capacity, and as I mentioned, the compensation fund has been established for almost 7-8 years, but their disbursement has been very low, and that's because it's marred in very complex administrative and bureaucratic hurdles. And that's where we come in as a UN treaty, trying to simplify some of those things. So I would say, and of course, one last thing, I think we also need to have a better handle on data, because I think data harmonization and ensuring that we do identify the most vulnerable and the different caseload with this problem, and have a more targeted approach rather than, so we are working on that, because often we have an issue with the government because their definition of a displaced person may be different from us, and their definition of durable solution is probably different from us as well. So we need to really also harmonize and basically clean up the data we're working on.
Thank you very much. And Paula, from your perspective, what are the barriers you're seeing, and thinking about what Abdelrazak and Nader have shared with us about the very real operational barriers where they're seeing, what do you see the UN and your office particularly can contribute to help alleviate some of those barriers that civil society is facing in delivering legal protection services in humanitarian settings?
Yeah, many have been already said. I might reiterate some. So first is the operational silos. So humanitarian action still operates in silos, even though we have tried for this to change. And And legal protection is often seen as a niche activity, no? Even though we know through it underpins every other outcome, as we heard from the person from Niger, for example. So this is one thing, and I also saw a comment on the chat from the DRC, which is what's happening also in the east of the DRC, where I had a recent mission where there's no presence of the national institutions, so there's no access to bank. There's like total lack of documentation, etc. So that's and it's obviously a paradox for the IDPs, because without the legal assistance and documentation, they may receive the short-term aid, as we heard, but they are unable to exercise their rights, especially, and this is my last report, on urban settings, where they most of the time become almost invisible. Something I also have seen recurrently is it's perceived as a neutrality risk. So some actors fear that engaging in justice or accountability may politicize the humanitarian operations, and yeah, right-based humanitarian work requires impartiality. We know that, but not silence. I know in some contexts this is an ongoing debate, and it's a hard one. I've also seen a lot of lack of coordination between the humanitarians and the rule of law actors. So as humanitarian actors withdraw, the justice systems and the transitional mechanisms are not yet operational or fully operational, and the IDPs are left without the recourse. So people may survive to the conflict, but they remain trapped in structural violence. So this is very, very important. And I would finish with still limited participation of the IDPs, no? And this is like a constant message from my side on the real engagement and leadership. We say governments have to be in the driving seat, but I think it's the IDPs at the end that really lead the way. So obviously with the political will of the government. So this is a super important message. They are the ones that know the context. They are better equipped to tackle the dynamics and the complexity of the context. So this is, and also in the data that we just heard about, empowering them as well with knowledge and ability to monitor and to own the data, because it's about them and their progress and their solutions. And I just wanted to say something else that I don't hear a lot in the conversations, Ida, which is, and that I think we need to advocate more for that, which is the issue of prevention. Like putting, and it's said today with what Nadar said at the beginning mostly, so prevention, it's at the end treating legal assistance and documentation as life-saving services, no? And as we know that humanitarian budgets are stretched to the breaking point, while trillions are spent on weapons, and assistance is to the IDPs is increasingly limited to the life savings intervention, leaving little room for recovery or solutions. It's a major mistake because then there's recurrence of the new violence and the new conflict. So prevention, I would bring it up as a major issue that we need to discuss more about. And justice and protection definitely is totally related to prevention.
Thank you. That's a very good segue to our next panelist, but also a reminder of some of both Ghulam and you touch on barriers that we've already touched about. We often talk about the barriers, the external barriers to engaging legal protection, but there are internal barriers to our own sector, including the perceptions we have that it might hamper access, that it will hamper the perception of neutrality, but also our own internal systems that may be standing in our own way. Thank you very much for flagging the issue of localization and the importance also of leveraging local voices as actors and not just recipients of legal protection. So thank you both for this. I would like to welcome our next and last panelist, Sarah. Paula has rightly, and Ghulam as well, have mentioned the issue of funding and the fact that area of work is siloed, not only because of practice issues, but also because of the sequencing, not only of how funding arrives in context, but also the kind of funding instruments that are used and that are available to civil society and legal practitioners. So Sarah, Sweden has been a leading global advocate for protection, for accountability, and for rights-based action. From your perspective, how can donors bridge humanitarian, human rights, peace building, and development agendas?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ina. It's a great question. And it's really a privilege for me to speak after so many knowledgeable panelists. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for that. And as you mentioned, protection is really an important priority for Sweden and a key element in Sweden's humanitarian strategy. And that's really placing a particular emphasis on the reduction of the risk of violence facing crisis-affected people. So coming back also to the preventative part of protection, as Paula was just mentioning. I think, first of all, we might not yet be able to really break the funding silos that we have as donors. But I think we can really make the best use of our convening power and really support effective planning between humanitarian, human rights, peace building, and development actors, and make sure that programming is based on a common understanding of the main protection risks and how we can provide a response building on each and everyone's added value. I think, I mean, one of the bases, and I think it was, somebody mentioned it earlier as well, it's really important for us as humanitarian actors, but also in discussions, dialogue, and planning beyond the humanitarian sphere, to have the appropriate data and information on the main and most acute protection risks and how those can be mitigated or addressed. And I think that will look very different in different contexts. And some of our panelists, I think you really made a point about the importance of legal protection, not only to reduce the risk of violence and abuse and by addressing the vulnerability to threats in the immediate and short term, but also as a way of reducing protection risks and ensure access to assistance and services through a more human rights-based approach in the medium and longer term. And as you said in the beginning, I think, Ina, legal protection is really core to both survival and recovery. And I think you all made very important points on this. I think with regards to legal protection, we also have to turn to our development and political colleagues, that was also mentioned, and to collectively ensure that humanitarian action is complemented by advocacy and with and capacity building of duty bearers for the rule of law and the implementation of applicable international and national legal instruments for protection, for people's protection and rights. I think we really need to look at how we contribute to that ecosystem that promotes and respects human rights and international humanitarian law. I don't know if you want me to say a few words on the underfunding and the reset.
That would be welcome, yes, before we also give the opportunity to the floor to ask you questions. But if you have a few points on, yes, the reset and what implications there are for funding of legal protection work.
I mean, I think with regards to the reset, we do see a risk that not only legal protection, but protection in general is sidelined and deprioritized. And I think there, as a donor community, we do have a responsibility to demand and support partners to uphold quality standards We must continue to request and hold partners to account and support partners to ensure that we have programs with quality, dignity, and that are safe for affected population, and that protection are really put at the center of programming, and that programs are also corresponding to what affected people request. And I think that was also a point that was mentioned. And I think by doing so, I think it's important that we as donors are synchronized in messages and requirements, and we are trying to work with other donors to be that. And I think we have to look at success, stop maybe looking at success only in how many people have been reached by assistance, but also look at success of programming by using a more qualitative narrative around strength and protection, which in turn, as you've all highlighted, can lead to reduced human suffering, reduced humanitarian needs, and really be an entry point to service and longer term solutions and the full enjoyment of human rights. I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. So what you and thank you for being so candid about this. It's a collective challenge we're facing alongside donors in making sure that this reset doesn't become a resetting down of protection work and a resetting down of legal protection. So your partnership and your allyship alongside multilateral actors, but also civil society and frontline workers is really something that we appreciate. So thank you so much for being here and for also highlighting how we can leverage the convening power of donor governments and reconnecting the diplomatic and political arms of governments in very humanitarian sectors as well. Thank you, Sarah. I will now open the floor to the voices in the room, the expertise in the room, the insights in the room. You've got panelists spanning civil society, multilateral actors, the UN, and donor governments. So over to you. Where have you seen legal protection fundamentally change outcomes? What barriers would you like to explore? What insights would you like to share? Over to our audience. I cannot access the chat for questions. So if someone can help me.
Hi, Ina, this is Dora speaking.
Yes.
I can see that we have a question in the chat from Abdul Malik Naji. I don't know if you feel comfortable voicing it over or if you want me to go ahead. So I'll just go over. So it's a question for Mr. Ghulam. How can the United Nations enhance access to this detained individual, especially considering the need for stronger advocacy for this vulnerable population? And it's about the growing concern regarding arbitrary arrest, particularly of women, without due process, largely due to the government's challenge in controlling certain armed groups.
No, thank you. I saw the question, and I mean, my area is humanitarian and development, so it's an issue of broader access to activists and those. I mean, Iraq does have its obviously its challenges with armed groups, and to the extent we do work behind the scene to bring to the attention of the judicial authorities and the government to allow access to the UN and basically what we can do behind the scene. This is a work that was largely carried by UNAMI, and unfortunately they will be closing in 6 weeks' time, and I think that is that's an area where the human rights section of the UN was very active. We're not really sure how, again, the issue of funding and whether the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights can sustain itself once UNAMI leaves and they can do. But just to bring it back to the IDPs, there are IDP communities which are also sometimes suspected of alleged ties to ISIS and others, and we're very active in terms of working with security and judicial authorities to make sure that there is a due process. particularly for those who are coming from Northeast Syria, from Al-Hol. The UN has established an accountability task force together with the government of Iraq, and especially those who are women and children, especially the children who were probably charged with crimes, or they're being detained now that they are adults, but even if some crimes were committed as a minor. So we are making sure that there is, UNICEF is very much involved in that and working. So, but the broader issue of Iraq's arbitrary arrest, I think that's at this point beyond the purview of this conversation.
Thank you. I'm not seeing, I see a hand up. Goriti or Amala, please come in.
Yes, thank you very, very much. I'm listening very keenly because I'm in Cameroon, and we are supposed to be doing this accelerated transition. So the presentation given by Ghulam has really helped me, because now I have something to report next week when I meet with the GPC and the partners, because I was wondering, we are being pushed into this accelerated transition, which luckily, or to our advantage, is not taking place anywhere. Because I kept saying we cannot have a transition within 2, 3, 4 months, especially in a country that is undergoing elections. That was before, and then now we've had the contested elections. So I'm really, really thankful that you've really given me something to talk about in terms of putting protection at the very center. We talk about centrality of protection, but I guess many of the people don't understand just how critical it is. The example I use is dead men don't tell tales. Keep them alive today so you can at least provide them with shelter or food. But if they die today, how do we say that protection is not life-saving? So we are struggling with that. We are struggling in a country that is very complex, with almost 3 different types of conflicts or crises going on at the same time, with the Anglophone crisis in the Northwest, Southwest, and the protracted situation in the far north and the Lake Chad Basin. So it's really like a cocktail of all the things that are likely to explode. Plus, we are so underfunded. And what I've seen in my position as a cluster coordinator for the last couple of years is really the diminishing. We've tried to advocate and push for protection, but you see oftentimes the donors, thank you, you're in the house, donors will give money for food because it's tangible. So we asked, you legal people, what do you bring to the table that we can touch, we can smell? If we can touch it, we can smell it, it's real. And I keep telling them, if one is not protected, then they're exposed to a whole host of protection risks, and the circle continues. So thank you so much, Ghulam and the presenters, for putting me on a firm road to protection as facilitating sustainable development and transitional justice. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Goriti, also for surfacing probably the need for communication and experience sharing across contexts, because if what Ghulam shared about Iraq today resonated with the challenges you're facing in Cameroon, probably there's also around the data and information a need to better share good practices, best practices and experiences across contexts. Thank you. I see Elena's hand up.
We do have a hand, but there are a few questions in the chat if you wanted to take those as well.
Yes, sure. Did you have a question?
Yeah, of course. So first, thanks so much for this. As a non-lawyer, it's always really fascinating to listen to the protection rule of law folks speak and really articulate exactly why access to justice is life-saving. So I just want to thank you for doing that for all of us. My question is, you've all really rightfully centered most of your interventions around clients, those who need legal assistance or other protection aid, as well as talking some about duty bearers and the need to do advocacy inside and outside of the systems that we work. But the word that I haven't heard as much today, which is I think a companion to justice, is accountability. And I was wondering what space you all kind of put to accountability in your work? What space should and does accountability play in the work that you're doing? Thanks.
Thank you, Lena. Does one of the panelists want to take this question? Because you haven't addressed it to anyone in particular. And then the next question will be addressed to Razak, Abdul Razak. So Bola, Sarah, Nader, Abdul Razak, Ghulam, what is the space you see for accountability?
On the question of accountability, I think it's an excellent question. Again, I think ultimately, the issue of protection and justice and accountability rests with governments. We're there really to provide support, whether it's legal, whether it's I think our role comes in both technical, but I think also what Sarah mentioned is advocacy is really key. And making sure that we as the international community bring the international humanitarian law, the norm and the standards that are out there. And again, I think we've seen in the past few years over Gaza, Ukraine, and other wars, how the sense of humanitarian law have been actually undermined. So I think we really need to make sure we don't retreat and protect that space. And secondly, also, I think a big lesson for Iraq is that even if you wind down and deactivate cluster and wind down humanitarian, protection needs do not diminish. And therefore, it will go on, perhaps for as long as it takes. And justice and accountability is part of it. So we have to make sure that, again, we work with local and government and also central government to make sure that those elements are embedded in their policies and laws, and make sure that it doesn't fall off. So just wanted to reflect on those 2 points.
Ina, if I may. Can I add something, Ina?
Sorry, I couldn't unmute. Yes, of course, please come in.
No, I just wanted to add to what we just heard, the importance in justice and accountability, the importance of reparations, the importance of truth commissions and other investigative mechanisms that help identify, obviously, the patterns, the responsible, the land grabbing, the forced evictions. I think these are key. And understanding those patterns can also help develop a better early warning systems. So now we go back to prevention, and obviously creating accurate registries of, in the case of my mandate, of IDPs and obviously other victims, can and does improve accountability. And with this accountability and transitional justice reparation programs also comes the importance of transitional justice reforms. Like, these reforms need to be set, and there's a lot that's been already done by many humanitarians that have the information, that have the documentation to support this type of reforms that I think are also important. And finally, obviously, the symbolic measures, the public apologies that help combat discrimination are also really important. There's something that can be done better as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Nader, and then we'll move to Abdul Razak.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really great question because, at least in the context in which I've been operating in, we really need to climb the accountability ladder. We engage in domestic legal remedies, not only because it provides a reprieve, but because international law also stipulates that one must exhaust all domestic legal remedies before pursuing international litigation, for example. However, in the past, whenever we do exhaust domestic legal remedies, we just turn to advocacy. We try to rally local diplomatic missions to pressure the state to cease and desist from executing an imminent violation. And this is because local and international organizations alike are hesitant to go forward with any sort of international litigation measures due to fear of punitive measures, which would hinder their operations, whether being shut down or expelled. And we need the diplomatic and financial protection for organizations pursuing international accountability, whether it's through indemnity funds, rapid legal defense mechanisms, or even like humanitarian exemptions from punitive closures. So exhausting domestic legal remedies doesn't just, mean advocacy or an organizational death sentence. There needs to be something beyond the safety net for the humanitarian community who wants to engage in pursuing accountability. It always runs a risk when you're trying to hold the state actor who runs the country in which you're operating in accountable for the actions that they're carrying out. So it's a very complex question for us, I would say. Over.
Thank you very much. So Abdulrazak, there was a question for you in the chat, which I will ask in French. Les collègues demandaient si vous avez des exemples de la manière dont vous avez utilisé les systèmes de justice coutumière avec succès pour soutenir les droits des personnes déplacées et des réfugiés en matière d'accès à la justice au Niger ou pour d'autres droits.
Merci. J'étais sur ça, effectivement, quand j'avais mis fin à ma communication tout à l'heure. Et en fait, au Niger, dans plusieurs zones où vivent les communautés mixtes, il y a un problème d'accès à la justice. Et elle est quasiment inexistante dans certaines zones. Et il y a certes des mécanismes traditionnels, mais le problème, c'est que ces mécanismes traditionnels laissent les femmes, par exemple, et les filles dans des situations où leurs droits ne sont pas pris en compte. Et c'est des systèmes traditionnels qui fonctionnent sur la base de certaines barrières culturelles et d'un certain nombre d'écarts dans l'exercice même de leurs moyens de rendre la justice. Il y a beaucoup de pesanteurs, il y a beaucoup d'aspects sur lesquels donc certains, surtout les femmes et les filles, sont lésées et la justice n'est pas rendue. Donc ces mécanismes traditionnels pour nous ne sont pas réellement appropriés et ils ne répondent pas à l'équité, à l'égalité, qui sont les bases essentielles sur lesquelles la justice est rendue. Donc, je ne sais pas si je réponds à la question. Sinon, ces mécanismes traditionnels existent, mais nous pensons qu'ils comportent beaucoup de barrières. On a parlé de ça du point de vue de l'accès à la justice, réellement, la justice.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, Abdulrazak. And that's indeed a challenge. C'est un des défis que rencontrent les gens in many of the contexts where we need to mitigate the impact of crisis on people in a context where there's a vacuum of formal actors and where informal structures are still playing a role, and we need it to be aligned with the standards of the rule of law. It's been a very interesting, but also wide discussion that we wish we had more time to continue. It has also surfaced some of the things that we don't often discuss, and I think both Abdulrazak, Sarah, Paula, Ghulam, and Nader all surfaced some of the things we need to spend more time thinking about when we think about legal protection, including data and information, what data, what information, what insight do we leverage. Lena brought a very interesting viewpoint on accountability and how we bridge local national service delivery to be better connected to wider accountability frameworks, including at national level, but also at international level, and how we yield advocacy in a way that supports accountability and not just information sharing and making sure we mobilize the right kind of actors. We are facing a very critical moment in the humanitarian sector where, as many of you have flagged, the risk of deprioritizing protection is a very real risk at a moment where we need to center it even more, because as all of you, particularly Nadar and Ghulam, flagged, even when we transition out, and we do hope to transition out of humanitarian and emergency operations in many of the contexts where we are, even and particularly when we transition out, it is even more more important to double down and to invest more resources in legal protection, because it's the foundation, it's the infrastructure, the social and legal policy infrastructure that is going to consolidate and sustain the gains that we've all made. So our investment in humanitarian action can only be sustained if we carry them forward by being present when it's acute, but by sustaining investments forward. And investments, as Sarah mentioned, are not just money, for not just advocacy and political will, but also leveraging local techniques, local expertise, local voices in the way that Razak is doing, mobilizing our system as Ghulam is doing, and making sure we also address some of the very real bottlenecks that we're seeing in our own sector and the challenges that we need to transcend to really bring meaningful change to the communities. So thank you all for surfacing all of this, but also highlighting the very real work that we're all doing in different ways. I would like to give the floor back to Pep to close us out at this very end of the Global Protection Forum. And thank you all for joining us today, and wishing you a very, very, very good end of your week, and looking forward to continuing working with you in different contexts and capacities. Over to you, Pep.
Thank you. Thank you, Paula, Sarah, Ghulam, Nader, Abubakar, and also Dora for your support. And thanks, Ina. Thank you very much for moderating such an enriching discussion today. And thanks to all the panelists for sharing such critical insights. The session, I think it was a perfect way to end this year forum. As it reminded us that we cannot have an effective humanitarian response and build the bridges to longer-term solutions if we don't put the rights of the people first. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the more than 1,600 colleagues from all over the places that attended the Protection Forum this year. Thanks to all the moderators, partners, donors who shared their experiences during this week and perspectives and contributed so much to the success of this forum. The forum continues every year to provide an essential platform to discuss critical protection issues and think collectively on how we can continuously advance protection outcomes for affected people across crises. As we must leverage our limited resources and prioritize our efforts more than ever before, it is essential that we continue working together as one protection community and bring other sectors and actors along to help us to address effectively protection risk that drive humanitarian needs and support long-term systemic changes that ensure the protection of affected people and the enjoyment of their human rights. Humanitarian action must respond to needs, but also must mitigate protection risks. If risks are reduced, needs will be also reduced. And that's our collective responsibility as humanitarian system, and that's centrality of protection. I cannot close this forum without a personal reflection on this challenging year. I mean, you all are suffered and are suffering the impact of the funding cuts on the services that your teams provide to people and in your own teams. And also we have faced this in the global protection cluster. Due to this situation, we had the reflection a few months ago if we had the capacity to run the Protection Forum this year. And talking to our most close partners, if it was the time to go ahead with the Protection Forum. And we thought that with the situation that we're facing, the forum was needed more than ever. And this was also one of the introductory points that our colleagues from NORAD made at the opening of this week forum. With the situation that we're facing everywhere, discussing and putting protection of the offer to discussion was more needed than ever. And I would like to close also to thank the colleagues at global level that despite the few resources that we have currently managed to organize all this work and to make it happen. In particular, I would like to thank Marielle Dozin, who is working here in the Global Protection Cluster, and my colleague Johan Vigne, because both of them have been the driving seats to make all this happen, and also all the partners that so enthusiastically engage. I mean, with such a strong protection community, I'm confident that we'll overcome all the situation and succeed and continue defending protection at the center of humanitarian action. We're facing extreme difficulties, but I will finish this forum full of new learnings, listening to so many brilliant colleagues, but also super motivated because all the expertise that we have in the community and the strong commitment that we have, and I see in all of you. So thanks very much to all of you for this week. And I'm so happy to continue working with you in the coming years. Thanks very much to everyone and have a nice week. And with this, we close the forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Great.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Be safe.
Bye-bye.
Get some money.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Merci.
Asanteni sana. Kwaherini.
Bye.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
À la
Bye-bye.
prochaine.
Merci.
Bye.
À la prochaine. Bye-bye.
Yes, Fatima.
Where am I leaving from?
Goodbye.